Catherine Ham, Brian Wilson, Brian Neiman, today's newsmakers, and you. The Morning Majority, 630.
WMAL. 6:37 on the Morning Majority. Somebody just noting in my Twitter feed that President Obama may be running on getting bin Laden and toppling Gadhafi. Sort of an unexpected platform for President Barack Obama. We've got James Carafano from the Heritage Foundation to update us on what the heck is going on in Libya. How's it going, James?
Hey, it's good to be with you.
You're up and at him this morning.
He's had too much coffee this morning, I can tell.
No.
He's been following the news 24/7, and he's ready to go. James, what is the latest in Libya? It's the brother of Gadhafi was supposedly detained, and then he shows up and sort of taunts the rebels. What's the status here?
Well, yeah, it's actually pretty discouraging. So this morning there are reports that there's pretty heavy fighting in the city. You know, anybody that's familiar with urban warfare in any way, shape, or form knows that, look, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. Yeah. You literally need masses of people. You have to go street by street. It's always very destructive. So the fact that there are, forces in the capital, they're just not giving up, that just means that it's going to be a long, bloody week. I mean, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to hold the capital or drive the rebels out, but if they're going to stay and fight, it's going to be a messy week. And it's not a good, omen for the future, because there are places that Gaddafi's people could, go into the hills, if you will, and continue a guerrilla campaign for some time. And so that's not promising in terms of a rapid transition to a stable country and relative peace.
Was this a case of rope-a-dope where they allowed the troops to come into the center city and then they sort of then got them surrounded, that they sort of come out of the hiding and then begin their attack on the rebel forces?
Well, it could well be. Urban warfare, fighting in streets is hard for militaries that are trained to do it, and
these guys aren't, right?
And everything else, and armored vehicles. I mean, the rebels don't have any of that. They're a loose-knit band. They don't have armored vehicles. They don't have air support. So it's not hard. I mean, anybody that's ever seen Saving Private Ryan remembers the famous scene from the end when like a handful of GIs hold off. That's realistic. So. It can get very, very bloody, sadly.
So is it possible, then, that we could have Gadhafi going into the hills or wherever outside of the city, and the rebels or whoever having control of the major, cities throughout the country, but Gadhafi waging a guerrilla warfare
Tripoli?
That's one option. Here's what concerns me the most going ahead. We got to this point because all the disparate factions in the country were united in one thing, is that they didn't like Gadhafi. And if you look at the leadership, there's dissidents, there's expatriates, there's former government people that have flipped over. They don't necessarily all have a common agenda. I mean, I wouldn't exactly call these guys the founding fathers. And if you look at even the NATO support, before everybody had their own agenda in Libya, the Italians, the British, the French, the Turks. So the question is now that, Gadhafi is no longer the poster child for the Libya operation, do people continue to kind of pull together? Because I think that's very, very important. For the council, for example, has been very, very adamant that, we're going to keep the extremists out and blah, 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 because they knew that they wouldn't get Western recognition, they wouldn't get Western money without that. So now, kind of without Gadhafi, I think we're going to see people's true colors come out. And if they're not kind of all pulling in one direction, Libya could still be a very, very messy place. I'm not so sure this is what I would run on in my presidential campaign.
What would be a good sign in the next couple of weeks to say that they are sort of pulling together? What would you count as encouraging?
Yeah, well, you would first of all you would hope that when they take control of the capital, that you see relative calm and order, right? That you don't see reprisals, that you don't see political things that look like they're turning off civil society, or they're starting to. That's the kind of thing which would be a good sign, and then it would be very interesting again to see what the Europeans do and what they say. What's going on in Europe now really, really matters. I mean, the French banks are in very, very bad shape. I mean, now the common wisdom is there's not going to be a default, but there's huge problems in France. Of course, Britain just had all these riots. So those countries are relatively distracted. Even, Italy's on the brink. those countries are relatively distracted. So it's difficult to see how they're really going to be paying attention. The president, for all he says and everything else, I mean, obviously he's really concerned about his reelection campaign. He's concerned about the domestic economy. Nobody's going to be pouring massive resources into Libya.
Right.
And if things aren't going well with the government, people are going to be really reticent about
James, whether the devil we know is bad. I mean, Gaddafi was a bad guy. The devil we don't know, it's sort of an open question, but there is this report floating around that there's a draft constitution that the rebels may be starting to work on that bases the new government on Sharia law.
Yeah, so I know about that. Matter of fact, our constitutional guy blogged on that on the Heritage website at heritage.org on the Foundry. The document itself is very disturbing for people that believe in constitutional rule and a healthy civil society. And he has an analysis that goes through that. I think the issue question is whose draft constitution is that? Who wrote it? Who put it up there? Who's really responsible for it? And what does it really represent? And that, I think, the experts really are in clear agreement on.
All right.
What do you expect? Do you expect Gaddafi to just stick it out and either, stay as long as he can, or do you think he will actually leave the country?
I'm not a betting man. You hear all kinds of rumors, and all things are possible. So, we've seen, obviously people go in all different directions. Hussein stayed, and tried to lead a rebellion against the people. I mean, Gaddafi's a megalomaniac. You could certainly see him doing that. And this really highlights one of the serious problems with the strategy going forward. I hope we learn our lesson here. There's something called the International Criminal Court. It's supposed to be a court of last resort when there's absolutely no governance whatsoever, where you could take really bad people and try them for crimes against society. One of the first things that this White House did and the other countries did is they ran into the Security Council and they turned the court to make an indictment against Gaddafi. And why that was a really bad idea is twofold. One is it actually encouraged him not to leave because since he had no place to go, any place he'd go, he'd wind up in The Hague. But the other thing is that it really took away from the Libyan people. You had a transitional government there. You had their ability to, in a sense, govern their own people and decide their own future.
Right.
So I think that was a huge mistake. I think it actually prolonged the conflict. And again, it really does take away any incentive for him to leave the country.
James Carafano, very instructive. Good to have you on this.